We are obviously coming up on our fantasy football playoff push right now. We are trying to get the best seeding possible, and the reality is we need points from every single angle. Every position available in your lineup, we need to maximize points. And the beauty about kickers is if it is done correctly, you can maximize points. And a fun fact, we had 14 kickers in week 10 fantasy football that had over 10 points, at least 10 points or more. So there's a right and a wrong way to do fantasy football kickers. And I do it every single week on this channel to maximize your points in fantasy football. So today we are going through the top 12 kickers in week 11 fantasy football, guys. And all I need you to do to qualify to get one of these free hats is go down there, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below your hottest take for week 11 fantasy football, and you will have a chance to randomly be selected for one of these hats. So please go down there, drop a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Let's go ahead and just dive right into these kickers right here. So number one, Dustin Hopkins has been a stud. Over the past 3 or 4 weeks, Dustin Hopkins has been almost untouchable. And this was a guy that a lot of people doubted last week heading into the week because they were playing the Baltimore Ravens. Well, not only did Baltimore lose the game to Cleveland, but Dustin Hopkins was, again, a fantastic kicker. 13 fantasy points last week. The dude doesn't miss kicks, and he gets plenty of opportunities. You can see the numbers on the screen. For those of you new to this channel, 12.1 fantasy points per game for a kicker. Not only is that outrageous, those are wide receiver 2 numbers right there. Those are running back 2 numbers right there. Those are greater than most tight ends you're going to get. That's why kickers are important, and Dustin Hopkins is the most important. Number 2 and 3, Jake Elliott and Harrison Butker. They're both playing each other in the Super Bowl rematch. First of all, I can't wait to watch this as a football fan. Monday Night Football, I cannot wait for it. It's going to be an excellent game. Now, here's the reality and why they're both back-to-back at 2 and 3. Here's the thing. When you have this matchup with this kind of scoring upside, you need to have every option in either offense, because both of these offenses could put up 40-plus point games. Now, the problem that ultimately comes with this is you look at a guy who we'll get into later, Brandon Aubrey of the Dallas Cowboys. Now, the Dallas put up 30-plus points on the New York Giants in week 10. Brandon Aubrey didn't have a great week. Why? Because he didn't have 1 field goal attempt, and he only had 7 extra point attempts. Only 7, like that's low. That's a high number, but that's only 7 points for you because 1 extra point is worth 1 fantasy point. But when you have this high of a scoring potential, I want every piece of this offense. Every single one of them. And that includes kickers here, because the reality is, with kickers in this type of matchup, even if they both go for 6 touchdowns each, right? They both get 42 points. In the off chance, or maybe not even an off chance, that they get field goal attempts, I want one of these kickers, and that's why Jake Elliott is number 2 and Harrison Butker is number 3. Dropping down to our next tier, Brandon McManus of the Jacksonville Jaguars this week, taking on the Tennessee Titans. So Brandon McManus has been one of the best kickers in fantasy football as well. You can see he's almost averaging 10 fantasy points per game. Now, the only problem that he has is that he's missed 2 field goal attempts, but really when you get to this part of the season, there's only a couple guys that are perfect. Harrison Butker is one of the few perfect ones that we just discussed. Even Dustin Hopkins has missed kicks. So I wouldn't make too much of this, because the reality is that as good as Jacksonville's offense is, they do stall out sometimes. Now, obviously, don't look at week 10 and say, like, and if you're looking for evidence that Jacksonville's offense is good, don't look at week 10. That's not a good week to go use as a barometer for how good they are and how good they will be moving forward. Jacksonville this week is playing Tennessee. And what I always say on this channel is that kickers in divisional matchups always have more upside, because divisional matchups, they're unpredictable, and they're usually lower scoring affairs that get field goals to win these games. That's why Brandon McManus is at number 4. Number 5, Justin Tucker, also taking on a divisional opponent this week against the Cincinnati Bengals tonight on Thursday Night Football. Justin Tucker is just the kicker that obviously everybody knows the name, right? Like, He's a legend. He's a Hall of Fame kicker if I've ever seen one. You see these numbers on the screen, and he's getting better week by week. Like, he was originally in the bottom 5 of kickers for the first several weeks of fantasy football this year. It wasn't going good for him. He's raised his number to 8.7 fantasy points per game, but when you look at his field goal attempts and his extra point attempts, he's missed 5 kicks this year. That's way out of character for Justin Tucker. The reality is this week, they're coming off another divisional loss from Cleveland last week. They're going to be motivated to win. And again, divisional matchup here. They're probably not going to be super efficient getting in the end zone. And I've discussed this, and it relates to kickers. And specifically with Justin Tucker, so let me explain. Lamar Jackson struggles against divisional opponents way more than he does against NFC opponents. Why is that? It's because divisional opponents like Cincinnati, like Cleveland, like Pittsburgh, they get to prepare for Lamar Jackson twice a year. NFC teams only play him once every 3 years. It gives him an advantage against those teams. These divisional teams, they know what to expect from Lamar, and that's going to slow down their efficiency, raising the upside of the kicker in fantasy football. Matt Prater of the Arizona Cardinals here. It's been a long time since I've had him in the top 12. He's taken on the Houston Texans. So there's really 2 reasons why Matt Prater's back. Obviously, like, you can look at the numbers on the screen, and like, that's nothing like we've seen the past 5 rankings, right? Those are not special numbers whatsoever. Matt Prater had one of his best weeks as a fantasy kicker last week. What coincided with that? It was the return of Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray inevitably raises the ceiling of this offense, and that helps the fantasy football kicker. And in addition, they're taking on the Houston Texans defense, which is not as good as I thought they were going to be by this time of the season. And the reality is, teams are putting up points against Houston. They could be beaten. So to me, Matt Prater is squarely back in position as a middle end option as far as top 12 kickers go. Jason Myers of the Seattle Seahawks taking on the Los Angeles Rams. Number 1 kicker last week. He was excellent. He scored lots of points last week in fantasy football to the tune of 21. Like, he was not only perfect on every single kick, he made some long field goals as well in the 40 range. So to me, Jason Myers is, he's in a great offense for a fantasy kicker. And the reality is because fantasy kickers, as I've discussed for a long time on this channel, fantasy kickers have higher upside when the offense is good enough to get you there, but they're not efficient enough to punch the ball in the end zone. Because as we discussed earlier, an extra point's only worth 1 point. You get a field goal that's 40 yards, that's 4 points right there. Jason Myers has those opportunities. He's getting more field goal attempts, as you can see on the screen, than he is extra point attempts. And I think that continues this week against a divisional opponent coming off a bye, by the way. Nick Folk, Tennessee Titans, at number 8 here. Nick Folk is taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. Again, it's all about the divisional matchups, and really Nick Folk has been a great fantasy kicker as well. He's averaging just under 10 fantasy points per game, and he's missed 1 kick all year. And he's kicked a 53-yard long field goal attempt, so you know that the grandfather of the NFL can still boom it. Nick Folk hasn't lost a step, and it's incredible because he's in his 40s. Nick Folk is a great fantasy kicker. It continues this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, another divisional foe, which is, again, great for fantasy kickers. Greg Zuerlein at number 9 here. Greg Zuerlein of the New York Jets taking on the Buffalo Bills in Buffalo. So I basically lost my mind last week discussing Greg Zuerlein. And I'm going to reiterate it again because I just think it's hilarious. Look at the numbers on the screen. Obviously, like 10.5 fantasy points per game, that's a great number. 23 field goal attempts compared to 6 extra point attempts. It still makes me laugh. The outrageous level of inefficiency on the Jets offense as far as punching it in the end zone goes, it's so crazy. But it makes it better for Greg Zuerlein because 23 field goal attempts, that's up there in top tier range. Like, that's fantastic. It's the reverse of a guy like Jason Sanders of the Miami Dolphins, who started out the year as a great fantasy kicker option, but now he's in the bottom 3 of fantasy kickers on the year. Why is that? Because Miami is extremely efficient punching the ball in the end zone. New York Jets are the exact opposite, which gives Greg Zuerlein a massive leg up, pun intended. Jake Moody of the San Francisco 49ers taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in San Fran this week. So, Jake Moody, over the past several weeks, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag. He started out the year as actually a really good fantasy kicker option. And then it's kind of gone a little bit downhill. Kind of like a Tyler Bass of the Buffalo Bills, who started out very well and now has really just kind of decreased. Now, Jake Moody hasn't decreased to the level of Tyler Bass. Tyler Bass is now one of the worst kickers in fantasy football. If you have Tyler Bass, drop him, pick one of these guys up. I guarantee you at least one of them is on your waiver wire right now. Jake Moody is a better kicker because, yes, he has 30 extra point attempts, and those extra point attempts are going to keep coming. But he still has 17 field goal attempts as well. That's not a bad number whatsoever. So Jake Moody, still a top 10 option for me this week. Brandon Aubrey, I said we'd get into him, and we're going to discuss why he's down this low. He's taking on the Carolina Panthers. So when you look at Brandon Aubrey last week, I mentioned this earlier in the video. I said Brandon Aubrey has been a fantastic fantasy kicker all year. You can see the numbers on the screen. He's averaging over 10 fantasy points per game. He's been almost perfect on every single kick, and he's made a 58-yard long field goal. Check on every single box you need from a fantasy kicker. Brandon Aubrey had a down game last week. He had 7 fantasy points, which it's not the worst, but it definitely is not one of the best. As I said, there was 14 kickers with at least 10 fantasy points last week. So what was the problem last week? Well, Brandon Aubrey kicked 7 extra point attempts and 0 field goals. None. He didn't kick a single field goal. Why is that? He played the New York Giants defense. They were perfect against the Giants defense. If you think it's going to change this week against Carolina, I got news for you. I don't think it's going to. Now, do I think you should drop Brandon Aubrey? I wouldn't say that. I don't think he's a bad option this week. He's in the top 12. I'm just saying that when a team like Dallas is going up against that much of an inferior opponent, the likelihood that they'll be getting a lot of field goal kicks as opposed to extra point attempts, it's not as high. Brandon Aubrey is definitely better off in a tougher matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, for example. Will Lutz, rounding it out in the top 12 of the Denver Broncos, taking on the Minnesota Vikings this week in Denver. Will Lutz was perfect last week. Will Lutz had a great week in fantasy football, and those numbers on the screen are not impressive, right? Will Levis is on the rise because, as I admitted this week, I was wrong about Denver. They're on the rise right now. They're efficient running, and they're scoring more points. The best part about this is for a fantasy kicker, I actually think Will Lutz is going to be a fantastic fantasy kicker moving forward. Because the reality is, Denver's offense has a ceiling. They absolutely have a ceiling. They're not going to get you 30 points in a game and get you 4 or 5 touchdowns. That's not in their DNA. They're good enough to get you down there. And that's why last week, Will Lutz was awesome in fantasy football. Will Lutz is going to continue to do that against the Minnesota Vikings this week. And honestly, if he's on your waivers, I would make a strong case to pick this guy up. So let me know what you think of the kicker rankings in the comments below and what questions you need answered for Week 11 fantasy football. And if you want to see the top 12 defense rankings for Week 11 fantasy football, click on this video right here.